floating into you. From the moment I saw you, I knew you were mine. Take my hand and follow me through the darkest night. You are the one, you're all I need. Your body is a wonderland, soul is a masterpiece. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Take my hand while the stars are shining bright. Every touch of you makes me feel alive. We're shouting out loud and losing our minds. We're unbreakable, we're fire. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Just when I saw you in the river next to me, everybody could see. All I want is to give you my love, and I hope that you wanna be with me. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in the river of my hometown, floating into the river of your soul. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Floating in, floating into, floating into you. Floating in, floating into.